Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed.
Hey, I'm Geoff Pallay, back with you for another episode about historical ballot measures, your topic and my favorite topic here. We're going to talk about Alaska today, which is the 8th state we've covered here in our podcast Historical Ballot Measure series. But before we get started today, we are in the middle of our Ballotpedia Society membership campaign. And today I'm asking you, listeners, to make a monthly donation to Ballotpedia. In doing so, not only will you have an incredible impact on voters across the country, but you'll become a distinguished member of the Ballotpedia Society. What you might not know is that Ballotpedia is a nonprofit. While our content is free to access, it's only possible because of generous support from people like you. That's why I'm inviting you to join the Ballotpedia Society with a monthly donation. As a listener to On the Ballot, you know firsthand how critical this work is, and while the information on Ballotpedia is, again, free to read, it isn't free to produce. So as a nonprofit organization, the work we do is only possible because of the generous people and thousands of donations we receive each year. So please visit donate.ballotpedia.org/ontheballot to donate today. Thanks for listening and for supporting Ballotpedia's mission. Now, on to the episode. And today I'm joined by Ryan Byrne, our Steam Ballot Measures Managing Editor. Ryan, happy September. Welcome back to the show.
Yep, thanks for having me back.
We go all over the country in our Historical Ballot Measures touring campaign. We've done Arizona, California, Texas. We've been all over the place. Now we're going to head off to Alaska. So Alaska, which became a state in 1959, voters were already shaping its political future before that even. It's one of those states where the ballot measure history is actually older than the state itself. So what did some of those early years look like in Alaska's ballot measure history? I read something about the Tennessee plan, which kind of sounds bizarre to be in Alaska, but talking about Tennessee. So what do we know about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start off. The Tennessee plan. So it was actually April 1956, 3 years before statehood, and Alaskans approved the ballot measure, which people called the Tennessee plan. And that was by a margin of 61% to 39%. So why Tennessee? So it refers to this kind of statehood strategy that was first used by Tennessee all the way back in 1795. Instead of waiting for Congress to act, Tennessee, the territory of Tennessee, elected senators and representatives and sent them to D.C. to directly lobby for admission to the Union. Now, Tennessee was pretty successful and succeeded fairly quickly, so this strategy became known as the Tennessee Plan. Several other states actually employed it as well to help achieve statehood, and we've seen some other territories and jurisdictions use it in recent years. Puerto Rico very intentionally did something similar a couple years ago. DC has been electing so-called shadow senators for the past couple decades. But yeah, back to Alaska. So following that April election, residents elected 2 U.S. senators and 1 U.S. representative. Of course, not official U.S. senators and representative. But these officials, they weren't officially seated in Congress, but they went down there and they advocated for Alaskan statehood. And generally, the analysis of that they were pretty successful and they helped move Alaska towards statehood itself.
All right, now I understand a little more about why Ballotpedia has a bunch of articles about shadow representatives and shadow senators. So that's great. You can read more about that on the site. Okay, so what's the state's overall record look like when it comes to total measures, different kinds of success rates? What really jumped out at you when we finished compiling the numbers in the report?
Yeah, so since 1956, which is how far we go back again, a couple years before statehood, there's been 220 state ballot measures in Alaska, which amounts to about 6 per election cycle. I think an election cycle is a 2-year cycle. This is just above the mid-range for states. Alaska is one of 26 states that allow initiatives and referendums, so voters can propose new laws through initiatives. They can also repeal existing laws through veto referendums. They do not have the power to initiate constitutional amendments, however. So about a quarter of those 220 ballot measures were citizen-initiated, while about 66% were from the legislature. And there's always a handful of these automatic constitutional convention questions in Alaska. But what stands out, I think, when you compare Alaska to other states, is how typical it looks quantitatively. Nothing really stands out as being all that odd, but then you look beyond the sheer numbers at the quality and types of ballot measures, and that's where things get kind of interesting and very Alaska specific.
Collecting signatures in a state as big as Alaska must be quite an adventure out there.
I imagine.
So, yeah, I can't imagine they have a distribution requirement then that relates to the geography of that state. So, one thing that was pretty interesting was how many times Alaskans have tried to move the state capital from Juneau. For all of you listeners who have played the states and capitals game with the Animaniacs, voters even approved moving it twice in the 70s. So, what happened there, and why did the capital ultimately stay in Juneau?
Right. I think for people familiar with Alaska's geography, Juneau is located down there on the panhandle, spanning the Pacific coast and far from the large mass of Alaska above it. So over the years, Alaskans have weighed in on their state capital. In fact, it's been 9 times. The first time this came out was in the 60s, 1960, 1962, when voters rejected proposals to move the capital. But that tide shifted in the 70s. In 74, Alaskans approved a measure to establish a new capital somewhere in Western Alaska. Not more specific than that. But that was kind of a prompt to give Alaskans a more specific question. So 2 years later, in 1976, they were given a couple options, and voters chose Willow, which is a jurisdiction about 40 miles north of Anchorage, as the new site. So with this location set, the next question was funding. So in 1978, $966 million bond measure was put before voters to fund the construction of this new capital city, because there actually wasn't a lot in Willow. It wasn't necessarily a city. And I think to put this in current dollars, it's something like $4.8 billion. So that measure failed. People weren't necessarily happy about the price tag, and the capital stayed in Juneau. A few years later, in 1982, the legislature said, okay, well, non-binding question, just to can we see if you guys are ready for the price tag. This time, $2.8 billion. Current dollars, $9.4 billion. Again, voters rejected it. So voters wanted a new capital, but weren't keen on how much it would cost. And then Alaskans kind of took another step on this. They passed measures in 78 and 94 requiring that any future capital relocation cost would have to be approved by voters. So they were very much, yes, maybe we can move this, but you have to come to us, just like you did before, but you have to make sure you keep doing it. Come to us about the cost. And then the last one was in 94. They were asked if they wanted to move it to Wasilla, famous for Sarah Palin was the mayor, I believe, at some point. That proposal was rejected. So leaving Juneau at new place as Alaska's capital city.
Yeah, so where the capital lies has often been a historical battle, whether you're in Hamilton and you're talking about, Philly, D.C., New York, or many other states have had quarrels over where to house its capital. So Alaska is no stranger to that as well. So you had to pick one or two measures that really capture the uniqueness of the political identity up there in Alaska. Which ones would you highlight, Ryan?
Oh man, this is a tough question. I mean, it's always fun to talk about the entire slew of salmon-related ballot measures, but that's not really unique to Alaska. They do that in Oregon and Washington as well quite a bit, which shows how important salmon are economically and culturally in some of these northwestern states. But I'll break the rules of your question a little bit, and I'll highlight one specific measure and then a quick string of interrelated measures. So to kick us off with just one specific one, this is something that some people might know about, but the Alaska Permanent Fund. So in 1976, voters approved a ballot measure to create this thing called the Alaska Permanent Fund. In the 70s, just to provide some context, Alaska was experiencing a major oil boom. And there was a number of legislators who had this idea that the revenue from the oil boom should not benefit just the current, but future generations. So they came up with this idea to propose a constitutional amendment that would require 25% of the state's mineral revenues, again from the oil, to be deposited into a fund. And this fund's principal would be invested to generate income. And it's pretty interesting. It's actually like a mix of investments, stocks, bonds, even private equity, even real estate. Alaska has investments in real estate. And as of 2025, this fund is valued at around $80 billion. And then in 1980, the legislature passed a bill kind of based on this that perhaps made this fund even more famous, called the Permanent Fund Dividend, which is a cash dividend sent to residents each year from the investments. So that's a pretty interesting one. And while we have seen certain funds like that in other states, they're usually tied to very specific things, such as land holdings for education investments. That's a common thing out west, especially. But the Alaskan Permanent Fund is definitely the biggest and broadest of these types of funds in the U.S.
Yeah,
Um,
I think most listeners are probably familiar with the dividend. You kind of hear about
the
that year. This year, Alaska residents are getting this much money
yeah,
from their oil dividend. But uh, how that came about via ballot measure, I suspect
did.
most people don't know.
It did. It came about by a ballot measure. And then there's also just so much more unique Alaska stuff. I think something else probably won't shock people too much is like Alaska. Maybe the shocking part is how this manifested in ballot measures. A recurring theme that we saw, especially like from the 80s through 90s, was the state's relationship with the federal government. I think there was and still is kind of like an Alaska Independence Party, and it used to be a little more prominent than it is now, but it's still active. Um, in 1980, voters approved a measure to create an 11-member commission to study and recommend changes to the relationship between Alaska and the federal government. 2 years later, in 1982, voters approved a measure that sought to claim state ownership of federal land in Alaska. In 1988, they approved a measure to give preferences to residents over non-residents. That was specifically aimed at us people down here in the continental 48 states. In 1996, voters, going all the way back to statehood, approved a requirement that any changes Congress might make to the Alaska Statehood Act would also need approval from Alaskan voters, or 2/3 of its legislature. Taken together, these measures reflected perhaps a soft skepticism of the relationship in the 80s and 90s about the state's ties to the federal government, and that's just something really unique that there's people in every state who I'm sure have some feelings, but it's the only one where we've really seen it manifest in a bunch of ballot measures.
Hmm. Well, yeah, Alaska. It had quite a unique set of measures. So they also had, obviously, as is probably they're more famous recently, I would imagine, for the ranked choice voting measure in 2020. And then 4 years later, another ranked choice voting measure to repeal it that failed. So Alaska became one of the sort of main fronts in this RCV battle. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I think as you noted, in 2020, voters approved this ballot initiative to establish top four primaries, and then along with ranked choice voting in general elections. So everyone's running the same primary: Democrat, Republican, Independent, so on. In 2020, the vote was pretty close. Voters approved it by less than a percentage point. And then there's an election in between, right? 2022, there's actually a special election first, where Mary Peltola, a Democrat, won the election. While she did place first in the plurality, of course, everyone was running in the same primary, and there were two prominent Republicans running in the top four. And then it went to ranked choice voting, and Republicans contended that, well, if you added those two Republicans together, but enough Republicans who voted for one ended up either casting a blank ballot or not voting for the other Republican. So Mary Peltola came up on top in the ranked choice voting. So in 2024, only 4 years later, voters faced another initiative, this time to repeal the system. And that one failed, but by an even thinner margin, about a quarter of a percentage point. So I think national groups who are interested in RCV kind of view Alaska a bit as a bellwether. If RCV can succeed or fail there, it becomes obviously a talking point in other states. So although Alaska is small in population, it's also often described as having kind of a distinctive political mix of kind of libertarian leaning, independent, coalition based politics, as we know. And because this is, one of the few states, the other one's Maine, that uses kind of RCV statewide in a bunch of elections. A few other states have it for like special elections. Especially if these big high profile federal elections, US Senate, US House, the debates keep resurfacing in ways that draw national attention. So something else to know is in that 2024 campaign, repeal supporters were significantly outspent by opponents defending RCV. So the repeal side, may seek stronger financial backing, or at least are hoping for it in 2026.
Yeah, the Alaska, and this is not a state legislature's podcast, so I'll keep this comment brief. But you're right about the coalition concept, because for years, Alaska has actually had a power sharing agreement in their state legislature where Republicans typically win a numerical majority in the state house, but there's kind of historically over the last few election cycles anyway been a coalition that comes together that's made up of a number of minority members as well. So Alaska certainly not your typical state is kind of what you're getting at. So let's look ahead to 2026 then. They've had a few initiatives in motion, one you already just mentioned, but what else are we looking at for Alaska's future when it comes to ballot measures?
Yeah. So we already have a slate of ballot initiatives. Not a ton, but we're looking at 3, and all 3 of them seem pretty serious at this point. So one of them's actually certified already, and the other 2 are in the process of collecting signatures. So the one that's certified relates to campaign finance, and it would create limits on how much individuals and political parties can contribute to candidates' tickets, things like that. Alaska used to have limits like this, but they were struck down by a court. This is kind of an attempt to walk that line between like what the court said and reinstating the policy. So that one's already been certified for the ballot. And then there's 2 others circulating. Again, ranked choice voting is probably, we'll have to see. They have to collect signatures and stuff, but it looks like we're probably going to get a repeat of 2024, looking to repeal RCV and reinstate partisan primaries and plurality-based general elections. And then the second one that's currently circulating is one to decriminalize psychedelic substances such as psilocybin, also known as magic mushrooms. And that's something that we've been gain some prominence in the ballot measure world over recent years. Not necessarily as much as, for example, marijuana, but who knows? Maybe it could take off like that and start a decade-long trend like we saw with marijuana. So we'll have to keep our eyes on that one. And again, Alaska, interesting state. It was an early state to legalize marijuana, so we'll see how that one plays out.
Always an interesting set of elections and the ballot measures. So, Ryan, thanks for the tour through the largest state in our union. And we'll see you next month for another episode in our HPM series. Have a good rest of your day, Ryan. Good to see you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about Alaska's ballot measure history at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next month, and make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Geoff Pallay, and thanks for listening. Norm will be back with your next episode.